5. Developing the Federal Indian Boarding School List. For the first time, the department developed a historical official list of federal Indian boarding schools. The Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative identified Indian boarding schools that received federal oversight or support. The number and locations of federal Indian boarding schools listed may increase as the investigation continues. For an institution to classify as a federal boarding school for the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative investigation, it must meet each of the following 4 criteria. 1. Housing. The institution has been described as providing on-site housing or overnight lodging. This includes dormitory, orphanage, asylum, residential, boarding, home, jail, and quarters. 2. Education. The institution has been described as providing formal academic or vocational training and instruction. This includes mission school, religious training, industrial training, manual labor school, academy, seminary, institute, boarding school, and day school. 3. Federal support. The institution has been described as receiving federal government funds or other federal support. This includes agency, independent, contract, mission, contract with white schools, government, semi-government, under, superintendency, and land or buildings or funds or supplies or services provided. 4. Time frame. The institution was operational before 1969, prior to modern departmental Indian education programming, including BIE. If an institution satisfies all 4 criteria, it is categorized as a federal Indian boarding school. As a result, an institution primarily operated or supported by a non-federal entity could qualify as a federal Indian boarding school if it met all 4 required criteria. Most institutions that did not qualify as a federal Indian boarding school failed to meet the housing and federal support criteria. However, it is possible that an institution that does not currently meet the 4 criteria may do so in the future as additional records are identified, examined, and analyzed, or as the department receives other information from federal, non-federal, or tribal records. The department performed final quality control on the list of federal Indian boarding schools to ensure each institution met the 4 criteria and to secure the accuracy of its first ever list of federal Indian boarding schools. Housing criterion. The department defined the housing criterion as meaning the on-site boarding of any American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian children for educational purposes. That is, the classification of a site as a federal Indian boarding school did not depend on whether the school housed or lodged 1 child or hundreds. Federal support criterion. The department defined the federal support criterion broadly, beyond direct federal funding and building infrastructure. The types of support that may qualify as federal support include the following. Contractual. Securing funds for education and agricultural personnel for Indian boarding schools from the 1819 Civilization Fund. Land. Acquisition of lands by congressional appropriation or private donation for the purposes of building and operating federal Indian boarding schools. Building and infrastructure. Federally funded construction or deconstruction of Indian boarding school sites included new building, dismantling of usable materials, and the moving of used buildings or recycled building materials for Indian boarding school purposes. Federal transfer of new or surplus buildings for federal Indian boarding school operations, including military installations and facilities. Federal renovation of federal Indian boarding schools through the Works Progress Administration Program. Equipment and supplies. Purchase of food, clothing, and education supplies, including farming equipment, livestock, and animals, with federal appropriations. Services. Provision of services including medical care or education. For example, the department determined that the federal provision of military personnel to teach Native Hawaiian children at select schools in Hawaii followed acquisition of the islands as a territory, but prior to statehood qualified as federal support. Also, the department considered federal provision of medical personnel to Indian boarding schools operated by non-federal entities to be federal support.